Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the fourth in our webinar series, Religion and Numbers. Welcome back to anyone who's joined us for our previous three, and an especially warm welcome to anyone joining us for the first time. This afternoon, it's a great pleasure for us to welcome not one, but two speakers from the Church of England research team. We've got Dr. Bev Botting, who is Head of Research and Statistics at the Church of England. And we've got her colleague, Dr. Ken Eames, who is a Senior Statistical Researcher for the Church of England. And this afternoon, they will be presenting their paper entitled, Can We Measure What We Value? Now, Bev and Ken tell me they'll be speaking for around 45 minutes, after which we'll have about 15 minutes for questions. And if you do have questions during the presentation, then please do feel free to add them in the Q&A box, which is on the bottom of your screen. So add any questions there, and I'll be picking all of them if we have time, or a selection of them later after the 45-minute paper. So without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to hand the floor over to Bev and Ken, and Bev will be speaking first. So over to you guys.
Okay, thanks very much, Julian, for the introduction, and welcome from me and my colleague Ken. As Julian said, we're going to be talking for about 45 minutes. And we've been thinking about this question of, do we measure what we value? But actually it also struck us that probably many of you are maybe even unaware that the Church of England has a research and stats team. So we're going to tell you a bit about some of the work that we do, which will put in context some of the deliberations we've had around what we value, what we measure, and is that what we measure? So that's the outline. I'm going to try and do that bit where we juggle everything around, and also try and share my screen with you so that we can show just a few slides. We won't have the screen on all the time, though. So this is what we've been deliberating on. Do we measure what we value? And I thought I'd start by just saying a bit about why our team is here. So the purpose of our team is to support the mission of the Church of England. One key criteria is that we try to ensure we collect high quality data, and that it's used in decision making locally, regionally and nationally. I'm aware that we've probably got a load of our own language within the Church of England. We'll probably talk about things like diocese, which for those of you that are not familiar with diocese, they're our regional areas, and that's actually where the most of the power lies. If truth is told, there's no power at the centre. We're very much a support group. And so our work, if you do know of our work, what you may be aware of are some of our routine annual reports that we produce each year. One of the key ones that most people look out for each year is our annual attendance figures. And we'll be talking a bit more about attendance as time goes by, but we're really grateful to all our churches. We collect information from two returns from them. One is about, we call statistics for mission. It's attendance. It's around marriages, baptisms and the like. We also collect information from them on their finance, how much money they take in, what they spend it on. We have a similar return from cathedrals, although also a lot more information from cathedrals around visitors, choristers, and so on. And we also have a report annually on clergy, where we use our own internal information. And they're the main reports that you can find easily over the years on our website. But you may not be aware that we also do quite a lot of other work. One of the most used resources is around some work on maps that we have. Ken's produced most of these, and this is some mapping. It uses ArcGIS, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, and it provides information at our parish boundaries. Again, if you're not familiar, the Church of England has its own ecclesiastical areas of parishes, which group up into dioceses. These don't agree with the local administrative parish boundaries you may be familiar with. So we have quite a task to do in order to transform the information that the Office for National Statistics and others produce onto our parish boundaries. But what we're able to do here is to map the information that's readily to hand, both from government sources and our own sources. We have point maps here of the map of the different churches that we have, and the colour scheme that we have on this particular map is around deprivation levels, which are incredibly helpful for local planning and mission planning and the like. And you can focus in on a particular area where we've linked in information from both census, and bearing in mind this is now quite old data from the 2011 census. We're looking forward to the information from 2021. We offer information on I'm just going to escape from there. Actually, I'll leave it on just for a tick. We also offer information for those trying to do research within the Church of England for the Church of England. So we have ethical advice. My background is survey design, questionnaire design, and so on. So I work with a lot of people to ensure that any resource that involved from the Church of England on research is used in the best possible way. Of course, measuring isn't something new since we've both been in post. And in fact, as this graph shows, we've collected information within the Church of England for many years now, for 60 years or more, on different areas. And some of these measures you may be familiar with, but all of these different statistics, one of the important things that we'll come back to is that it's really important to have trends. It's important to have those trends over time, and therefore to keep consistency in questions and try and get that balance between consistency and asking new questions, which of course we will all want to do. So I am going to stop sharing now, and I'm going to just finish by saying that measuring is not something new. We've obviously both been working for a while for the Church of England, but we have predecessors before us that have also worked hard on ensuring good statistics for the Church of England. So I'm going to hand over now to Ken.
Thank you, Bev. Thank you also to Julian and to everyone who is joining us in this webinar. I'm sitting in the glamorous surroundings of Church House, Westminster, partly for the unalloyed style of the place, but also so that I could get at the bookshelves and research and stats department and see some of the historic documents that we've published over the years that are full of fascinating charts and tables of diocesan trends in this, that, and the other. So this one here, massive thing from 1960s, has diocese by diocese numbers of bell ringers, organists, and choristers, and a slightly peculiar table showing the numbers of children of clergymen across the diocese of the Church of England. And my favourite one is from official yearbook of the Church of England from 1910, in which there's not so much detailed data, but there are some absolutely fascinating adverts. If you want to buy yourself some tubular bells, this book gives you the place to go to. And I find this stuff fascinating from a kind of historical, statistical point of view. And maybe other people will too, and a load of it is digitized and available on our webpage, so do have a look if it's the sort of thing that interests you as well. But I think sometimes we look through these historical tables and we think, what on earth were these people doing, measuring the number of bell ringers and measuring the number of choristers and all that kind of nonsense? And it's a bit tempting to kind of to scoff and mock at the folk of yesteryear and what they were up to. And I think that would be a massive mistake. And I just share with you, if I can, this quote from the introduction to one of these reports, from one of our boss's predecessors, from the report from 1965, where it says, "The importance to the Church of comprehensive and reliable statistics should need no emphasis. Without them, it is impossible to know the results of previous policies or to make confident predictions of future trends. Judgments based on feeling, flair, and experience are no substitute for the conclusions which can be drawn from statistical data, skillfully interpreted." I'm not sure that Bev or I would be able to put it any better ourselves. The folk of yesteryear knew what they were talking about. And it's sensible, therefore, to treat anything they've done with due respect on the basis that they probably were doing something that made sense at the time. Of course, the time was different and there were different requirements and different constraints that people were operating under and different priorities. So not surprisingly, they do different things from what we do now. The big question I think that people are often trying to grapple with is basically, how well is the church doing? Is the church flourishing? How healthy is it? And that's a really complicated question, it seems to me. So I pose this to the audience, and let's focus it down a bit. Let's just think about size of the church. How big is the church? If you had to answer that question, what would you do? And I'm not going to answer it right now. And in fact, we're not going to answer it today. But I think the main point with it is that actually, how big is the church is not a simple question. It's a complicated, fuzzy, woolly, multifaceted thing, as is church health. And I think all the measures that we try to collect and collate, and all the things that folk have done in the past, are trying to get at different facets of the jewel that is a healthy church. No one of them is perfect. All of them together, I think, give more and more useful information. They need to be treated as a whole. Having spoken so highly of our statistical predecessors, you might think that there are all-powerful statisticians sitting in Church House who get to tell every church in the country what to do and how to do it. That is not the case. Probably a good thing too. But in fact, the Church of England has demonstrated over the decades, over the centuries, that it takes data collection very seriously. So Bev showed some figures going back to the 1960s. The Church of England has been collecting data back to the mid-1800s, if not before. And in fact, it has gone so far as to write data collection into the law of the land. There are legal requirements for churches to collect data. That's how seriously we take it. On which topic I hand over to Bev.
Thank you, Ken. Yes, so as Ken said, the Church of England is governed by what's known as Canon Law. We are the established church, and as such, we have our own equivalent of parliament and government. And we have, therefore, our own laws, which are passed in a very similar way to the way that laws are passed in government. I used to work in government, and sitting in on the General Synod, which is the parliament of the church, is so similar to sitting in on parliamentary sessions. So we have our own laws that we have to abide by, and it's fascinating to see the fact that we have in our canon law. So canon law, there are some things which churches are legally required to collect in the form of registers. I am that sad person that knows the canon laws that relate to the data collection. And there is 2 canons, one called F11 of the register books and their custody, and one F12 of the Register Book of Services. And the key thing about the Register Book of Services is that there should be provided a register book in every church and chapel. And into the said register book shall be recorded every service of public worship, together with the name of the officiating minister and so on, and a few other things. Given that that information is collected religiously, to use a word, by every church and every chapel, it means the information is available easily for people to collect and send through centrally. There's a lot of other stuff that we would like as well. The canon law itself doesn't actually cover attendance, it covers communicants, but all the service register books do include a column for attendance, and in the majority of cases that column will be completed as well. The church has an interesting attitude to data collection. There are those who can find Bible verses who suggest it's wrong. And there are others who can find the Bible verses that suggest it is a really important element of what we do. And you can get quite easily involved in Bible ping pong of people trying to say that what we do is right or wrong. But it seems to me that where we're spending money on churches and new initiatives, where people are giving money that's coming into research, we have a professional responsibility to do that properly. We don't actually decide in our team what we should collect, but what we do is spend a good time listening to people, listening to colleagues, to people in dioceses, to people in churches, and really listening hard about what it is that they need to know. And we have lots of conversations around the line of what do people need to know, and what therefore can we, and we can then advise them on how best we can get the information for them. Some things we can collect quite easily at diocesan level. We can ask dioceses to tell us about the buildings maybe that they're responsible for, or the number of clergy that they have, or the number of lay ministers, those that are not ordained, that they know of. But some things we do have to talk to the churches themselves, and then actually it's best if we talk to maybe the vicar and find out from them some of the information that's needed. For example, around how many people are in their churches, how many weddings they've done, how many funerals, how many baptisms, and so on. But sometimes we want information about individual people. And those of you that work with surveys will know that you can't begin to assume characteristics of individuals in your in this instance, congregation. So that information has to be collected from the individuals themselves. So we, for example, if you want to know about the ethnicity of the people in your congregation and how that compares to the parish within which you're ministering, we need to use information from national census, population information on ethnicity for the parish information, and then we need to get the information from maybe some form of congregational survey. And we have recently developed a tool called the Church Development Tool, which will be doing just that. Sampling, though, is a bit of a problem because if we have just a small sample of churches responding to our requests for data, we've got no way of knowing whether they're representative. And we know that the reality is that it will be the keen people, the people who care about an issue, who are more likely to respond. So high levels of non-response to surveys lead us very much to doubt their value. So we strive very hard for a response from every church, and then use some estimation approaches, and Ken is an expert in these, to deal with non-responders. But actually, that we don't have canon law to cover everything we ask. So a lot of the data collection we do relies very much on the goodwill of people, whether they're clergy or people in congregations, to respond to our different surveys. I mentioned earlier the statistics for mission and our finance returns that we ask every church to complete. We have 16,000 churches in the Church of England, so it's not possible for us to go round to them all, to email them all, to phone them all. But we get an incredibly high response rate in the region of 90% for statistics for mission. And even over the past year, where we've had been in the grips of a pandemic, we took a very soft, gentle touch with people responding this time. And even so, the response rates remained largely high. And we think that that is because the churches, along with us, recognise how important it is to have good information. Because the information we have actually is of limited use for us. We can do the best we can in terms of the data quality, in terms of providing national summaries, diocesan summaries. But the real value of the data is at grassroots level. It's at the individual churches being able to look at their information and make their plans based on their own local knowledge and context. And it's up to us to try and translate the things they tell us into information they can give. So in order to keep that response rate high, we need to keep the burden on those providing the information as low as we can. So we try to measure things that are easy to measure and things that people already know. Part of that takes us back to the legal requirement and the registers we've got. But of course, I always stop and remember that most of those filling in our annual returns are volunteers. They are doing other jobs themselves, they've got families, and they're doing this on top. And many won't have access to all the different things we need to find out from their church. So we do need to keep things as simple as possible. And that's part of the issue around this whole thing about how we measure, because sometimes it is incredibly difficult to measure that key thing we really want. So is there a proxy that we could collect instead? Over the past decade, we have been collecting this information electronically, and that continues to help those who are providing the information to provide it in a way that we hope is as simple as possible. And the system that we set up to collect the data has the facility to add additional surveys to it. So for one good example is that recently we've introduced an energy footprint tool to enable churches to do a very simple energy calculation for their church based on their utility bills. Now, the fact that we were able to add this to our existing data collection system means that the people use the same username and password, so that makes it easier for them to enter it. We use the same font, the same look of the website, and therefore we're hopeful, and it seems to have worked, that the people coming in to use the energy footprint tool recognise it, feel comfortable with it, because it's like the other tools in our suite. One of the things, though, that's particularly important is thinking about what we should be measuring nationally, for our colleagues nationally who are setting policy. And you may be aware that the Church of England has a new vision led by the new Archbishop of York. And it's a vision on trying to become bolder and humbler, and actually there was a large period of consultation. And we've got 3 strategic priorities in the next period of the life of the church. One is to be a church that's younger and more diverse. Most of you, I'm sure, will be aware of the anecdotes that the Church of England is full of little old ladies. Actually, we don't necessarily have the information to prove that, but most of us have some anecdotes that support it. But in order for us to know whether we're becoming younger and more diverse, we need to know where we're starting from and whether we've made any difference. And that is the kind of information that we do need to collect from individuals, because only an individual will know the full honest truth of their demographic. The second strategic priority is to be a church where mixed ecology is the norm. What that means is that every person in England has access to a wide range of different churches, a new form of church, in order to find a community where they feel comfortable and can grow in faith, and to add those new forms of church. And the third priority is to become a church of missionary disciples, which means that instead of just having the impression that it's up to the vicar to go out and talk to everyone, it becomes imperative on everyone in the church to go out and talk about their faith and bring other people into the church and into their own faith. Now, that's a huge vision. And our role in all of this is to help the policymakers monitor the impact that this vision has had, to learn from these initiatives, so to review, to ponder on them, and maybe make changes. It could be that we see elements of growth in different directions, and therefore we need to help those making policy to have good quality information that they can use, so that they can measure the things that they value. And at this point, I'm going to hand back to Ken.
Thank you again, Bev. So this brings us back to the original question, which is do we measure what we value? To which my answer would be a definite yes, in the sense that if people didn't value it, people wouldn't know the information, and they certainly wouldn't spend the time telling us about it. In fact, I think the reality is it's not that we fail to measure what we value, it's that we are not currently able to measure all of the things that we value. So we find when we talk to churches, I don't think I've ever come across a church that says we don't care how many baptisms we do. What we get are churches that say, you ask us about this stuff, we do this as well, and we'd like to tell you about it. So the reality is not that we don't measure what we value, that we don't measure everything that we value. The other reality is that there are cases where although we measure it, we can't measure it directly. So we were talking about church size earlier on, and even things such as attendance, they're very hard to get at precisely. What do you mean by attendance? At what point does someone have to turn up in the service for it to count as attendance? So the precision of some of the questions is hard. And in reality, if we're honest with ourselves and with the users of the statistics, what we are getting at are sensible proxies for the size and the health of the church. And sometimes this kind of surprises and unsettles people because they want to get at the thing, and the thing is not measurable and never will be. But actually, again, if you step back and think about it, it's not that surprising. We are used to working with proxy measures all the time. But a general election, what you want to do is know the will of the people. What you count is the votes cast in constituencies. That's not the same thing. It's a sensible proxy, but it's not the same thing. At the Football World Cup, you want to find the best football team. But you don't find the best football team. You find the team that scores the most goals against another team in a game. It's a different measure of best, but it's a decent proxy, and we're happy with it. So sometimes these proxies are really sensible, really directly related to the thing of interest. Sometimes they are correlates, let's say. And I don't think that is a bad thing. particularly when we're conscious of the burden of data collection that we've already talked about. Something that Bev mentioned earlier on was to do with trends, and I just want to reshare a slide that Bev's already shown you. This is the October count, so attendance at church during October, which we count year after year. And this is our sensible proxy for church attendance, one of our sensible proxies. And you can see quite clearly on this chart a little discontinuity between 2012 and 2013. And that's because back in that year, it was decided that we should start asking churches specifically about attendance at services for schools. We hadn't done this before, and some churches would include their school service attendance in their reported figures, and other churches wouldn't. And if you look very closely at this, what you'll see is a big step in the number of, so the kind of light blue bars, the number of children being reported, a big drop from 2012 to 2013. And that drop is almost certainly mostly to do with the fact that the school service attendance is now in the dark blue block that is specifically the school service attendance, as indeed it should be. But this change in question, of course, means that interpreting the trends becomes difficult, and we have to wait for another few years for the trend to settle down. And we are always fairly cautious, and I think justifiably so, about not changing questions willy-nilly, because sometimes the trend is more important than the number, and actually having a consistent measure is better than slightly tweaking your measure to get a slightly better measure. While I'm sharing slides, I come back to another point I made, that we are of course flexible and adaptable, and the requirements change. So something we've asked about of late is social action taking place in churches, which if I could show it, I would. Let me see. Oh, there we go. So a few years back, we'd had loads of churches say to us, we are doing all the things that you're asking about, and those are important, but we also spend a load of time on social action projects. We run food banks, or we host coffee mornings, or we offer support for youth work or night shelters or whatever it might be. So we asked about this. And this little graph here shows the range and scope of work being done by churches in a whole variety of social action projects. Almost 60% of churches, Church of England churches, reported that they support food banks in some way. They generally don't run them directly because the burden of that is too big for their resources, but they're providing money, they're providing food. Loads of churches are running coffee mornings and lunch clubs and parent and toddler groups and all that sort of thing. And I think it's really important for us as the statisticians to give opportunities to recognise the things that are happening that we haven't previously been measuring. It's sometimes challenging because, of course, if we've not been measuring it, that might mean there is not good record keeping that allows it to be measurable. So you sometimes have to have a bit of lead time on this. And again, conscious of the burden, we will sometimes stop measuring something because otherwise the form gets bigger and bigger and bigger every year, and then people get grumpy. So we no longer count the number of bell ringers. Maybe we should. It would be of interest to some people, but we don't anymore. We've talked about attendance a bit, and there is, I think it's fair to say, a bit of discomfort in some quarters about measuring attendance at churches and effectively judging churches on their attendance. Does it reduce the beauties of faith and devotion to a simple count of, well, bums on seats, if you like? And I don't want to argue particularly with that point, but attendance is important, even if you don't think it's important in itself. So again, looking at the social action projects, in summary from this graph here, it's the same data set. The bigger the church, the more social action you're involved in. If you're a large church, you will be running several social action projects. If you're a small church, you won't be. And that should be no surprise that the bigger your church, the more people you have, the more skills you have, the more time you have, the more resources you have. It's no surprise that big churches are able to do more to serve their communities, and the same is likely to be the case in their work with schools and their ability during a pandemic to offer online services and all the other things that have been going on. The churches with more people can do more stuff. So even if you don't think that attendance is the thing, it's a pretty good correlate for a load of other stuff, and therefore an important measure in itself. I'll stop sharing the slides there. So actually, I don't think there's any great argument that we don't measure what we value. I think sometimes we fail to sufficiently value what we measure, perhaps because we feel it's a bit uncomfortable and judgmental to be measuring this stuff at all. Sometimes I think it's because we've forgotten that it's a proxy for the health of the church. And if we keep reminding ourselves of that, we might take some measurement a bit more seriously, or at least the numbers that come out of it a bit more seriously. A cynic might say, you've seen the figures we've shown, a cynic might say, well, we don't value it enough because the numbers are all going down and it makes us look bad, and it would be a lot more comfortable to pretend it wasn't important and therefore ignore it. A cynic might say that. I'm not cynical, so I'm sure no one else is either. But I think there may be it's not a surprising thing in organisations to say, well, this thing makes us look bad, let's just pretend it's not happening. It would be a mistake for churches and anyone else to take that position. So I should be handing over to Bev any moment. So I think the key points from this are that it's important for all this work with churches and other religious organisations that measurement is really complicated. It relies on the goodwill and the record keeping of thousands and thousands of dispersed volunteers that we cannot work directly with to support, even though we would like to, but there isn't the time, there aren't the resources. So almost certainly we cannot measure exactly the things that people want us to measure. We are obliged to measure stuff that is measurable. That's just the practical reality of it. And that, as I said before, we are getting at particular facets of the health of churches, and there are many facets, and there are things we can get at and things that we can't, and there were things that we will introduce and things that we will stop doing because situations change and priorities change. And now that we all have clocks, we don't need the church bells to tell us what time to get up and head to church. Maybe there's a good reason for not measuring bell ringing anymore. Our challenge as statisticians working in this field is to try to give a sensible overview, to try to show the whole picture, all these various things, this multifaceted world, to try to do it in a way that doesn't confuse, overwhelm, baffle, or bore everybody who might hear it. And I hope we have done none of those things to our audience tonight. And I think that's it for me, and I will hand over to Bev.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you, Ken, for that. So I return to the original question of, do we measure what we value? I know who the we is in the first part of the question. The we is us, our team, in terms of the information we collect and collate and hopefully transform into helpful information for those in the church who need it. I'm not sure who the we is in the second part, though, because it's definitely not the same we. The we of what we value is that we work with so many people across the church, and each of them have different priorities, different work areas, and they all value slightly different things. And one of the things we're constantly wrestling in is, within our limited resources, just how much stuff we can do. So we will tend to prioritise work for the main vision of the church. That has to be a priority, but also for others within the church to enable across the whole church at all levels to make decisions. We also have to have that balance between the historical. As Ken said, it's important to keep the trends so that we can see the changes over time. But we also have to be a bit nimble as well when things happen. I mentioned earlier the pandemic, and of course, you are probably aware that one of the first things that happened in the pandemic was that all our churches closed, and our clergy were incredible in terms of learning new technologies and providing new ways to provide worship for their people. Lots of different ways this was done. And that was one of the things that a few of us in the team spent most of last summer doing, was trying to work out how we could best measure the church at home, the form of words we used. How could we measure church at home? We had to be nimble. But in fact, it's now a new way of doing church. We think it will stay with us for a while. And again, if you're interested, we can give more details about that in the question session. But we try very hard to ensure that everything we collect has a customer, someone who really cares about and values the information we're providing. And there shouldn't be anything in our portfolio, and I do regularly check it, that nobody is waiting for. So that the resources from the team are spent in the best possible way, because I'm aware that most of our funding comes from indirectly the church and those coming to church who are providing funding. We don't have any taxpayers' money, and therefore it's important that we give the best possible service that we can to those across the whole of the church, both our policy colleagues centrally, our colleagues in the diocese, and those volunteering and the clergy in our churches. So I believe that we do measure what those who we support value, but I'd be very happy to take any questions now. Thank you, and back to Julian, I think.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Bev. Thank you, Ken. It felt like such a simple question when you first set it at the beginning of the session, and yet it became such a great sort of source of discussion and some great insights as well into your work. So thank you for that. It was a very rich presentation, actually, and I'm really grateful. I've got a ton of questions, but most of these occasions I will use my presenter privilege and sort of launch in with a few questions, but I'm not going to today because I realise that time is of the essence for some of us. So instead, I'm going to turn to the questions that we've been asked by our audience. So very kindly left some questions. So I'm going to start by putting two questions together. They're kind of related. They relate to technology and automation to a degree. So the first question is, why not use technology to measure church attendance, audio sensors, video, etc.? So why not use technology to measure church attendance? And the second question, which relates to that, is how did you respond to the proliferation of church services online during the pandemic, and how did they inform your count of attendance? So over to you two.
Thank you. I'll start and then pass back to Ken for some of the detail. Churches use lots of different ways to measure church attendance. Cathedrals tend to be quite an interesting one. They will often have effectively doormats that register every time somebody crosses them. The footprint effectively is measured so that cathedrals have an idea of how the footfall literally into the cathedrals. Churches will often use county clickers. I've been in a number of churches that have used those. And I mean, I did always have this vision that you could have a kind of like a loyalty card and you could swipe in and out. In terms of any kind of video and audio sensors, I think the key thing would be with 16,000 churches, it would be 16,000 times the cost of a system. But we're constantly looking at new ways of making the way of counting a lot easier. For me, one of the key things is that anything that a church estimates is always going to be better than anything we could do. Because actually, when they say, oh, but it's just a guess, what they're really doing is saying, we know that our church has got 100 seats and about half of them were full, so we're going to estimate 50 people if they don't have a clicker. In In terms of the church at home stuff, though, that has been a huge part of our work. And Ken and I, between us, could probably talk for another hour just about church at home. We're going to use the term church at home to use to all of the different elements. So some churches provided emails or weekly newsletters through their letterbox, although there were all sorts of COVID issues about posting things. Some people have had phone-in services where you could dial up to a service. Some churches that didn't have technology referred people on to the local cathedral. Churches tended to work together in small groups and maybe provide one service or another to the whole group of people and work together and really bring together the resources in the best possible way. And genuinely, we have been so impressed with the way that the clergy were so nimble and quickly learnt new technologies and were able to deliver really good worship. The problem comes, though, in trying to measure how many people are engaging with that. If we use the example of Zoom, some people put their worship onto Zoom, and like we can do here, we can see how many participants they are. And if we were to call up all the photographs, we could actually count through how many people were actually there. That is possible with Zoom. It's a bit more tricky with using Facebook or YouTube, where actually you have two problems. You have the count of devices. It's not a count of people. It's a count of how many devices were joined at any one point. And also each of the different technologies has a minimum amount of time. So it says, this is how many people viewed for 30 seconds. And that makes it quite tricky to work out how many people were really there and how many people were there because they'd watched something else and this was the next video in line. So we've been working with a group called BINCS, which is the British and Irish Network of Church Statisticians. Can give more information if anyone's interested, that I put together to try and bring together like minds. And it's a really good network for things like this that's brand new. But I think it'd be quite useful maybe if Ken could come in, because Ken added a question on church at home to our last statistics for mission return and has begun to analyse that information.
Yeah, thanks, Bev, and thank you for both those questions. They're both really sensible things to think about. Exactly as Bev says, the church at home stuff was frankly amazing, in that almost every Church of England church by the first lockdown was able to offer something, often online, but often other forms as well. And I don't know, it seems to me if we'd done a survey of people in advance, do you reckon the Church of England could go digital if it had to at the drop of a hat? I don't think people would have said yes, but it basically did. And I just think it's amazing the work that churches have done in that short space of time. The counting of people, as Bev says, is really problematic. So the best you get out of Facebook is 30-second views. So you get the number of people you watch for 5 seconds, the number of people watch for 10 seconds, the number of people watch for 30 seconds, for 1 minute on Facebook. It's not set up to tell you how many people watched your whole service, and therefore any of the attendance figures are not comparable to attending a service where you see people there for the whole time. Doesn't mean they're not useful numbers to collect, it just means you can't treat them in the same way as you might treat in-person attendance. What we don't know yet is what the long-term impact of it is. So my expectation a few months back was that a load of churches would have seen that they could do this, which is pretty astonishing in itself, and that people were attending, for want of a better word, and therefore they're probably going to carry on doing it because they can and people come. I'm not so sure now, because having thought about it a bit more, I'm married to a vicar, so I get local input as well into this. Running a church without doing online services is a full-time thing for the clergy and the volunteers and everyone else. Doing what they used to do took up all of their time and energy. If they're going to do what they used to do, which they're now doing that again, and do a new thing, well, what are they going to, that doesn't work, that you're going to have to stop something or suddenly find a load of new time. So I don't know, I mean, we will find out. I think there will be medium-term impacts as people carry on with the thing because it's now a normal thing. The long-term impacts I don't know about. We will ask, we will find out. I think there will be some churches that have got themselves a really well set up system where the effort of doing the online thing, for instance, is very low because they've got cameras in place and it's almost a matter of pressing a button. Other churches where it's a lot more laborious week by week, and they might have the resources to carry on with it, but I don't know yet. So I think there's been a massive temporary shift to online and other not in-person forms of worship. I suspect a lot, well, speaking personally, I know a lot of people are coming back to the church buildings now they're open again because they missed it. And it's much nicer to worship together than to worship on your own at home. For some people, the home thing works much better because they're working shifts and they're not around on Sunday, or they're housebound and can't get out. But I'm looking forward to finding out. We will ask. I'll report back when I know.
Thank you to you both. Bev, I love your idea of the swipeable card. I think that's great. I mean, I wonder if St. Peter might be on hand to redeem loyalty points at some point.
Well, exactly. It was. I maintained that a very good use of the church was to have a Costa coffee at the back, and therefore people who came in for Costa could hear the service and may be encouraged to move forward. And your loyalty card could be used to buy coffee, but maybe that's a little too flippant.
So moving on to a third question then, if I may. It moves away from measuring people and asks, does your research include statistical measurements of religious texts? So do you ever look at textual analysis using statistics in your work?
No. I mean, our work is very quantitative counting type work. I mean, we've got people with different skills in the team, but our stuff is driven by the needs that have been given to us. And in fairness, nobody's ever asked us to do this. If they were to ask us, I'm not sure. I would suspect that there are software packages that could do comparisons in that way quite simply.
I know that there are some AI tools that can do scriptural analysis, and in fact there's some going on in some of that analysis happening in Cambridge at the moment, and for anyone watching who's interested, the Woolf Institute is about to welcome a PhD scholar who's very much interested in that type of AI approach to religious texts. So it might be something we'll share on this webinar series in the coming months. We've got a few more minutes left, so before we wrap up, I wondered if I could ask a couple of questions of my own. I wondered whether the Church of England was interested or engaged in comparative analysis. You talked a bit about church attendance, and whilst we know it's a proxy for the size and health of the church, I wondered if you looked at comparable figures across other faiths. I know there was something made of the declining church attendance versus increasing mosque attendance as a way of talking about the changing religious landscape of the UK. And I wondered whether your church attendance data are ever compared in that way by your team.
No, because I mean, well, it's a difficult one, isn't it? Because it's then comparing apples and pears. We've done we have looked out with the Church of England to other denominations to see what's happening. So we've done work with the Methodists and United Reform and Baptists and so on. So that kind of work we do. We have done some public polls where we look at information, and one of the questions is religion, and look at questions when we're maybe trying to understand So, for example, one thing we did on a poll was looking a public poll saying to people, did they go to church? What was their religion? Did they go to church before the pandemic, and what were they planning to do afterwards? Now, the emphasis was around the church at home thing, but obviously then you do pick up people from other faiths. We haven't had the time properly to engage with other faiths. I think it's a fascinating one. Ken, have you got any experience with working with other faiths?
Well, I think the reality of it in many cases is that other denominations, at least other Christian denominations, do not have the same access to data. They're not collecting and collating figures in the same sort of way. So in fact, in many cases, it wouldn't be possible. The Methodist Church used to do a really, really thorough job of collecting information, but they have stopped that work. The other relevant point with this is that we get, through census and other sources, stuff about religious affiliation. And there are still a lot of people in the country, well, we'll find out, we haven't seen the 2021 census results yet. There are a lot of people who will tick Christian who do not do much church attending. Doesn't mean they're not Christians, but they don't attend churches. And I think if you were to push them, they would say they were Church of England. They wouldn't say they were Pentecostal or Methodist. So there is a lot of people who have a Church of England affiliation, but not attendance. Whereas I think if you have a Roman Catholic affiliation, you are more likely to be attending than if you say you have a Church of England affiliation. In a way, that's a wonderful thing for the Church of England, because there are millions of people who are not yet churchgoers who say they are Church of England. So good grief, let's find them and talk to them and welcome them into our churches. But it does make it quite hard working with any public poll data, because religion doesn't necessarily mean the same thing for each denomination.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. I do have other questions, but I see from my watch here that we're bumping up to our 6 o'clock deadline. So I think rather aggressively, I'm going to have to wrap up there. But I hope that people watching this afternoon enjoyed your presentation as much as I did. I certainly found it really, really insightful, a really interesting question. And again, I found it really... it was answered in a really interesting way. So thank you all for attending. For those who've attended more than one, thank you for joining us for this webinar series. I think given some of the numbers and reactions to the episodes, I think we'd like to continue in some form or other. And if anyone watching has any ideas or requests for future topics, for future episodes, then please do get in touch with the Woolf Institute. It's easily done via our website or via our social media. And all that's left for me to this afternoon is to thank again Bev and Ken for kindly giving up their time and speaking so well this afternoon. And thank you all again for attending. And I hope to see you next time. Bye for now.